Hi there, I just want to talk about teenagers, adolescence and regulation. This is a subject I'm fond of and know well because I have 3 teenagers. I have there's 2 14-year-olds and twins and a 16-year-old. Each bring their own challenges and beauties. Teenagers, I think, are actually quite misunderstood because they're prone to certain behavioural patterns. They're impulsive. They like increased risk-taking. They are emotional, instinctive, impulsive, aggressive, reactive. But recent research has talked about actually this being a normal developmental part of their brain development. It seems that there's a part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex, which is still developing. It's the last part of the brain, the whole brain, to develop. And the prefrontal cortex, which sits right at the front, sort of underneath the brow, above the brow area, is involved with regulation, emotional regulation. It kind of suppresses impulsive processes and decision making. So what happens is there's another part of the brain called the amygdala, which is more of a emotional part, which has already developed. So there seems to be this imbalance between these two parts of the brain. The amygdala's normal, mature size, but the prefrontal cortex is not. So the thinking goes that they use the amygdala more for problem solving, which means, and the amygdala is much more known for emotional, impulsive, instinctive, aggressive behavior. So literally, the teenager's brain is not wired up to contain this behavior, so it's normal behavior. There's also studies that show that another process, which is to do with the dopamine pathways, which are neurotransmitters in the brain, and they're very important. It seems that the dopamine pathways are showing more alertness. There's more dopamine going around at the time of adolescence, which means, again, it's linked with novelty seeking, risk taking, etc., etc. So you've got these 2 patterns. If you throw in the other challenges that a teenager has to see, I spend a lot of time working with teenagers. The type of problems that they come in are behavioural. Anxiety is a subject, I think, over the next while I'm going to be talking a lot about anxiety, because it's probably one of the biggest subjects going now, because I would say, maybe 20-30% of my patients in my general practice, and I'm sure in a normal GP general practice would be higher, but in my practice, which is gentle, albeit physical therapy, 20-30% of people present with anxiety, and one of the biggest groups are teenagers with severe anxiety. The thing is teenagers are faced with a lot of issues. They have, for example, this brain chemistry, that's a physiological problem. On top of that, the hormones are massively changing physiologically as well. The secondary sexual hormones are coming in, testosterone with its effects, estrogen, progesterone. There's a huge amount of pituitary growth hormone going on, and then periods are starting in girls with follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing, all these pituitary hormones are rushing through them suddenly. Big change in the physiology. On top of this, they're going through this huge physical growth. The body is physically changing in terms of its physical brain makeup, but also its structure. The body's changing physically, and that brings emotional challenges and changes to a girl and to boys. But the bigger thing about this is this, I think, is today's societal pressure. The pressure to conform to society, to shine, to be the most beautiful, the cleverest, the this, the that. And obviously we can blame the usual suspects nowadays, which are social media, popular media, TV, etc., etc. I treat children nowadays who are showing symptoms of stress, headache, stomach problems, difficulty sleeping, when they're 7-8 years old. And this just never happened 20 years ago. It just, was very unusual. Bullying, social pressures to conform within group structures is incredibly difficult. And these children need help. They really need help. Fortunately for me, the nervous system expresses itself through the sympathetic nervous system in the body. And so actually there are techniques that we can employ to calm down the nervous system and also almost rebalance the nervous system and take children who are incredibly in an anxious state to calm them down, physiologically calm them down. And it's a wonderful system, and I don't think it's the complete system, I think, but it can work terribly well. But sometimes you need some more talking support or cognitive behavioral therapy, etc., etc. Occasionally people need medication, but I tend to see quite severe cases. I always have. I just want to talk a little bit about the idea of kind of a tree growing straight. This is to do with scoliosis. I mean, it's most key when we're talking about children with cerebral palsy because of the imbalance in the nerve supply to the postural muscles, which are often imbalanced left to right. There's suddenly a growth spurt, so very straight kids with cerebral palsy can suddenly get quite severe scoliosis suddenly at sort of 12 to 14 years old. See it all the time. And I spend quite a lot of time, especially in the Daisy Clinic we have, trying to keep these kids straight, trying to keep the mechanics balanced, the nervous supply balanced. And we have to work quite hard with some of these kids, but we tend to do okay. But in a normal child without any neurological deficit, there can be subtle imbalances in between. Often they're actually suffered in the birth process, where, say, for example, the head is just locked a little bit more forwards one side than the other on the neck. It's very subtle. You can pick it up in babies. But as the posture develops, the head or neck posture develops, it's just slightly offline, just slightly. What happens, though, is we try and keep our brain straight. So as we keep our brain and eyes straight, the spine tends to compensate by producing curves, are slightly unnatural curves called scoliosis, and these can be very, very subtle or quite severe. In the very subtle cases where you've got these little imbalances, if you look at the mechanics of the spine as a whole, they're very readily open to change. So in terms of, sort of small kyphosis, kypholordosis and scoliosis, much more severe scoliosis is an area that we work with a lot, where there is some developmental problem either in the nerve supply or in the mechanics of the spine. Now those are severe childhood or adolescent scoliosis. Now that's a whole different subject and extremely hard to treat. Sometimes you can help them, sometimes they need surgery, but we work a lot in that area. It's a very tricky area, very different to what I'm talking about very subtle imbalances. Often if there's a child, a growing child or a teenager who has a small amount of sort of low tone, or they have subtle learning issues, which I'll come and talk to on later tapes, they can have imbalances in their postural makeup because of sort of a weakness in the postural tone and makeup, and we can strengthen that up in different ways. So there's a whole lot of things. I mean, if a teenager comes in, their brain is developing, and it's developing in a certain way, and the hormones are going crazy. I mean, often teenagers, just all they need is a few words of support, but just balancing out their bodies, allowing their structure to be balanced, their nervous systems to be calm, and that just helps them go through this massive transition point, because it's a huge time, and often teenagers are misunderstood, but the problem is that they don't make it easy for themselves because they're reactive and aggressive and impulsive, but we have to live with that as parents. It's an interesting dynamic. So what can we do to help these teenagers? The interesting thing is, because of the teenager's brain setup, actually they are naturally inclined to go to sleep later and then to sleep in the mornings. In tribal times, often the teenagers would be the ones who'd be out on watch for the tribes because they'd be up all night and sleep all day. That's their natural physiological makeup. Unfortunately, our schooling, apart from some schools who've adapted to this, our school system does not allow for it. So our kids are, they're at school at 8 o'clock in the morning when basically, do they wake up till 10? I'm not sure. And the thing is that's physiologically normal, interestingly enough. So I think they're allowed to sleep in sometimes. I think what we can do to help teenagers is they need to do some sport. They need to do some activity. They need to do some cardiovascular activity. I know it's being brought much more into schools, but I encourage my kids to come running and do bits and pieces of activity. We go for big walks on the weekends and stuff, just to almost to get the blood flowing through their system. It seems to calm them and help them. Diet's very important. Simply the less crap, the better. Processed food, sugars are shocking, put a huge strain on the liver. This is all very clear. In a teenage brain where the hormones are changing and all this brain development is happening, it's hugely sensitive to sugar and toxic stuff. And actually teenagers are more drawn to eating rubbish as well, which can make them more impulsive, moody and reactive. So the best way to manage teenagers from home is through keeping a nice diet with the steady stuff in it, with lots of vegetables, the usual stuff, and protein and carbohydrates in the right balance, without processed foods, simply. Managing anxiety. I think often teenagers find it very hard to talk about what's going on or to name what's going on. And if they can be safe either with yourself or with some sort of therapist as a parent, to name it, to say, actually, I'm feeling this. It's an incredibly large and huge step to name issues. I remember as a teenager myself, I had all sorts of stress and bullying at school. My parents didn't know about it until I was in my 30s, and they said, why didn't you tell me? And I said, oh no, I thought I could manage it. They were very upset at the time. So us teenagers, I remember being a teenager, you hold it all in, you contain it. So if we name what we're feeling, I think it's hugely important. There is some research around planning planning for futures and planning timetables with regards to exams and having some sort of clear planning process for them to follow structure. Structure seems to help them, meaning structuring their free time to some degree, so actually they're allowed an hour on the PlayStation or whatever it is, the computer, and then they have to sit and have dinner together. The social stuff is I think very important with teenagers, to have dinner together and all this kind of stuff and not be in their devices. My teenagers, literally, it feels like their devices are stuck to their hands. They're part of them these days, and we have to prise them away sometimes and have a conversation. So there's a lot we can do. I think nutritional support, evening primrose oil for girls to support their hormonal system, make sure they have enough vitamin C. Zinc is very important in a teenager. Sleep, if they can get as much sleep as they can. I know they're prone to staying up late, but actually we can get them to sleep early enough so they can get enough sleep, because they need far more sleep than adults. They're needing their 10 hours a day, and as adults we're needing a lot less. So anyway, that's a start, an introduction to regulating teenagers.